become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Global civilization is clearly on the edge of failure.
What are you really afraid of? Hast thou eaten of the fruit of the tree whereof I told thee thou shouldst not eat?
The moral to be drawn from this nightmare situation is a simple one.
You simply have to turn your back on a culture that has gone sterile and dead and get with the program of a living world and a re-empowerment of the imagination.
More than machinery, we need humanity.
Fundamental changes in society are sometimes labeled impractical.
Our birth, our death, our being in the moment, these are mysteries. They are doorways opening on to unimaginable vistas of self-exploration.
The contemplation of death and the acceptance of death is very highly generative of creative life.
Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts.
The society is trying to cure itself by an archaic revival.
What account would we give of our stewardship of the planet Earth?
The world is not an unsolved problem for scientists or sociologists. The world is a living mystery.
I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
Don't give yourselves to brutes. Men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, and what to feel.
Don't let it happen. It depends on you.
My name is Helena Norberg-Hodge, and I'm the director of Local Futures. And we're now in Ladakh. It's my 50th anniversary since I first came here. And that's where I learned everything that I've been talking about for 50 years, because it gave me this insight into a culture that hadn't been affected either by colonialism or later on modernity. It was this world unto itself, and it was a world where things really functioned well. It wasn't paradise, people weren't angels, but the relationships between old and young, between male and female, were in a balance that we can only dream of in the Western world. But I'm convinced that we can learn from that if we're willing to really look at the big picture. So Ladakh in 1975, when I first came, had evolved into a culture that was quite amazing. In a very barren land, there was remarkable material prosperity. And I encountered the happiest, healthiest people I had ever met.
And so bringing all of these people together that you've met over the past 50 years, what has been the experience like for you having this moment where you're coming back to Ladakh after 50 years, but with this group of your global community?
Yeah, so we organized a conference, what we're calling Planet Local Summit, and we invited people from around the world who have been collaborating with us or in one way or another translating our books or films, and who are really interested in the issue of how can we shift away from dependence on a global economy to rebuild genuinely circular, more localized, community-based economies. And it's been, wonderful. I haven't been back to Ladakh for 10 years. I was here every year for 40 years and helped to set up several nonprofits and, speaking the language fluently. I worked very closely with the people, from the young children to the leaders. And last time I was here 10 years ago, the impact of modern development was so negative. There was this increasing dependence on fossil fuels, particularly cars and trucks, but also building cement guest houses and hotels, and it felt quite depressing. Now, coming back 10 years later, there's been a huge shift, really remarkably big. And now even people I never met, young people, have read my book, Ancient Futures, and tell me that it turned their lives around because they really started appreciating their own culture. So as I keep telling them, appreciating me actually means appreciating their own culture. And it's really wonderful to see. And then to have invited about 200 people from around the world who also were very moved by Ladakh, but I think just as much moved by meeting each other. We so need to understand that there is a worldwide movement that rejects the consumer monoculture that's being imposed on us from above, from essentially a globalized corporate and banking empire that operates almost like a machine that cuts through relationships and that cuts us away from our sense of belonging to the land, to place, to the bioregion. So there's an awakening going on around the world as well, and to realize that we're not alone, to realize that these small initiatives are part of something very big is extremely empowering. So I loved seeing people meeting and just deriving so much joy and inspiration from meeting like-minded people. And so, from Myanmar, from Thailand, Vietnam, Japan, from, Germany, England, America, Brazil, Africa, there was this amazing meeting of minds. And so this summit was, I think, empowering and inspiring for the outsiders and for the Ladakhis. And I was thrilled to see how many Ladakhis who've gone away to university are coming back and wanting to step off the competitive consumer rat race. And so I'm feeling, very, very hopeful, very fulfilled. And of course, this is at a time when war and instability of every kind is increasing. So it's not that we're not aware that that's going on, but we are also aware of this testament to the human deep need for reconnection to others and reconnection to nature, and people are taking initiatives from the grassroots. The urgency of what we're facing today means that we really want to do everything we can to get this big picture out. A better understanding of the dominant system, how artificial it is, how crazy it is that we empower it, which we do, and how tragic it is that many of us are not even aware of some of the beautiful initiatives that are taking place even in the region where we live. But we haven't been allowed to actually change our lenses and to look for this testimony to essentially human goodwill. And what does it mean, goodwill? It means, above all, the desire to be in more loving and more collaborative relationships. And people are starting to build those across a divisive climate where social media does everything it can to divide us, to polarize us. Algorithms, this machine of man-made intelligence, supposedly, are operating to find ways to divide and polarize us in order to extract more wealth to the top, to the billionaires. So there's a lot to be gained by understanding that bigger picture.
So something that I've been thinking about the entire time I've been here, but also from reading your book, Ancient Futures, is there was a passage in the book where you described how you were washing your clothes in the river and a little girl came up to you and was like, no, don't do that. There's neighbors downstream. You can't do that. For me, reading that just evoked this sense of wow, we in the West, we in the global North have been really, really bad upstream neighbors. So many of the decisions that we make have an impact on the rest of the world that we don't even consider. And I'm just curious if you have thoughts about that, about what it means to be a good upstream neighbor.
Well, for sure, what I've seen is that when you're aware of who your downstream neighbors are, then you're aware that what you do has an effect on others. that's a prerequisite for being a good neighbor. This is again where we must decentralize and create units where human beings extract from nature and use other people to meet their needs in a way that allows them to see the impact of their action. So this is one of the main reasons for localization. As it happens, it's also about being aware of your impact on the natural world, not just on other people. Without that, I really want people to understand that they should not take on this guilt, that as Westerners, because they come from European background, that they somehow should take on the idea that they were racist, that they were conquering the world. No, in the West, we have also been victims of that system. We were driven away from the land through enclosures, and as I said, we were trapped into believing that this system, which was benefiting global elites, was actually benefiting us. So it's really, the big problem is ignorance, from the grassroots to the top.
All right. Can you describe for us what is globalization, and how did globalization create this separation from people and nature and the earth?
Globalization is actually a term for an economic process that started in the late 80s. And at that point, big corporations were pushing for an extension and scaling up and speeding up of something that had started much earlier. And if we go back to the roots of where globalization comes from, we have to recognize that before the modern economy was started, we had a situation where elites in Europe, through legal arrangements, forced people off the land into cities where they no longer had access to land or water, and they were now dependent actually on global trade. The same people were engaged in slavery, and in the so-called poor countries, the slaves were often, if they weren't transported across the world, they were often pushed off their own land to go into big monocultures to produce tea or coffee or wheat or whatever for the global traders. Then when the modern economy started taking shape, one of the fundamental principles was called comparative advantage. And that was saying it's not in your interest to produce a range of things for your region or your country. No, you should specialize, do monocropping for export. So when we look at what this modern economy did, was it destroyed even the knowledge that the real economy is the land, the water, the trees, life. It sort of brought people into this urban environment where it looked like the economy is money. But that money, in turn, was created by elites that pulled us more and more away from dependence and knowledge about the living earth, the real economy. Part of that buildup was schooling, which was brought in with the industrializing, globalizing economy. So children in school were trained not to understand the living economy and how they might be able to produce food, clothing, shelter, everything they needed, but instead they were trained to be experts within an industrial economy in the city, which again was extracting wealth to the top, to the global elite. By the time of the Second World War, or let's say the end of the Second World War, these global corporations had become so big and so powerful that they played a role in convincing governments and many, I think, well-intentioned leaders that in order to avoid another world war and in order to avoid a depression again, they needed to do everything they could to support a so-called integrated global economy. And so as part of that, after the Second World War, in Bretton Woods in America, they set up the World Bank, the IMF, and a very poorly understood process of global trade called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And I know for sure that there were many well-intentioned people who supported this process, really believing it would avoid depression and war and so on. But what it really meant was that they were rolling out the red carpet for global banks and corporations to move in and out of national economies without any restrictions. So free trade and freedom has been associated with that. It was actually the freedom for giant corporations and banks to have no rules, no restrictions. And this, I had my eyes open to in the 80s, and I was just so relieved to understand that this was a way to actually constrain this empire. This was focusing on those trade treaties would have been one of the most expedient and best ways of ensuring that these global corporations couldn't keep imposing an artificial, competitive consumer culture, turning food into products, creating a situation where worldwide food that had been transported from the other side of the world was cheaper than local food. So the artificial pricing that destroyed the farmers, that destroyed the local economies, all of this came from that process. So globalization then in the late 80s, roughly from the mid-80s, was a new push by big corporations. Having had the framework laid out after the Second World War, they were now pushing governments even harder to negotiate more trade treaties that gave them more freedom.
And how is localization an antidote to so many of these problems?
So having understood that, it became much clearer to me that we needed to do everything we can to support shorter distances, linking up particularly farmers and consumers. Very central in this is the work on the land. And, we can call it farming. It very often included trees. It included small-scale fishing. And all of that work provided for people's basic needs, food, clothing, and shelter, from the region. They were interdependent with each other and with the land. And doesn't mean it was paradise, doesn't mean it was perfect, but that is a prerequisite for an economy where human beings do not destroy the natural world and where they don't abuse and exploit other people. It creates the visibility that prevents the type of corruption that we're not aware of. But so localization is fundamentally about exactly the opposite systemic direction, doing everything to shorten distances, to connect people in more community-based structures. And as it happens, it's taking us back home to an environment, to a life that is how we evolved. It's who we are. It is therefore that we see, particularly in the local food movement, but in the localization movement generally, we see people coming back to life, to joy, to meaning. And we really, really hope that there will be a wake-up. I mean, my big hope is before I die, is that at least this discussion will be out there, broad enough to link the environmental movement to the social movement, to virtually every movement, every single issue is either caused by or exacerbated by the global system and will benefit from a shift to the local.
So I'm curious, maybe you could describe, how are the costs of global civilization, this global economy, how are those costs invisibilized to people?
Yeah, well, because of the long distances, most people are not even aware that local food is more expensive than not even food, products, artificial processed food from the other side of the world, or even, a banana or an apple that's been transported for thousands of miles will be cheaper in this completely artificial system. So the costs are made completely invisible because we've also been told that we're too many people now to go back to the land, and we don't realize that we're being fed by bigger and bigger and bigger monocultures that are disastrous. They're anti-nature. They demand chemicals. They demand essentially a system that is so anti-life that after a certain amount of time, that land becomes a dust bowl, which has happened with industrial agriculture in country after country across the world. The costs also to people are invisible because we're so trained into a narrow focus, and we don't realize, we're not even told, that one of the costs of the global system has been that we have to work harder and harder, longer and longer hours to just put food on the table, a roof over our head, and basic needs like health and education. So we're not even allowed to see what's happening to ourselves. Instead, we're told, we're richer and richer and the economy is growing, and we should feel so guilty if we get depressed, because just think about those people on the other side of the world who have nothing. And there we are complaining and feeling depressed when we have everything. So the invisible costs are at every level. And I think one of my dreams is that in the next few years that we could raise enough money to do a big study that would look honestly at the reality on the ground in several parts of the world, very importantly in America, which is held up as the model for the world, but other European countries, because Scandinavia, my native country of Sweden, is also held up as a model. But on the ground, what was life like in Sweden, in America, in Zimbabwe, in Japan, in Ladakh, in Bhutan, in the 80s, looking at indicators of social, and that includes psychological well-being, physical health, social cohesion, democratic stability, and the natural environment, the degree of pollution, the degree of biodiversity loss. Let's look at that in the 80s and then compare it with today. And we will see a dramatic decline in social and ecological well-being. And we'll see that it's again exactly with this process of very rapid and large-scale globalization. And I think that as a baseline would have to wake people up to really look at why. Why do we find now? It's really only a few years, that we've been talking about the polycrisis, that we've been talking about collapse, and we really need to understand where that comes from.
I'd love to talk about human nature. I'm curious what were your beliefs and thoughts about inherent human nature before visiting Ladakh, and did that change? How do you view that now?
Before I came to Ladakh, I had studied psychology. I was very interested in that. I'd also learned quite a few languages. I was interested in different worldviews. But it was really only after a few years in Ladakh that I realized that I had bought into the idea that inherently we're all the same. And I was not aware of the enormous difference between different cultures and worldviews. And that, of course, was what I had become really familiar with, was more industrial cultures. And I now see very clearly that the industrial push that industrialized us and that industrialized the rest of life massively increased neuroses, unhappiness, friction, competition. And it's very sad that we really don't have a record of any psychologists who've studied healthy cultures. I mean, I do qualify as one, and I do want to write more about it. I want to write more about childcare and about human relationships, because there is this very deeply embedded idea that indigenous cultures, pre-modern, illiterate, nature-based cultures didn't individuate, and that we have this superiority. And I've always said, no child that's born from his mother's womb ever has a problem recognizing that they're separate from their mother. Absolutely not. What is the issue is that we need to be reminded of our interdependence. And that's what indigenous cultures did. That's what Tibetan Buddhism does, is to remind us that we are part of a web of life, an inextricable web of life. But that, of course, is not so visible. It's not something that we see clearly in the material world. And so, anyway, when we lived according to the way life works, things worked much better. And what I saw so clearly is that local interdependence, that the fact that I knew I depend on you, you depend on me, that led to quite a natural, not altruistic, just a natural behavior where we helped one another. And it was spontaneous, it was natural, and of course it led to much more harmonious relationships.
And so, you were kind of touching on this a little bit, but why is human diversity, like maintaining rich cultures and cultural diversity, why is that as important as ecological diversity?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the truth is that can't really be denied. And that is that as we evolved over millennia, we evolved in specific climates and ecosystems. And we can see the rich cultural diversity was a consequence of the adaptation to life, to the diversity of life, to the different species of plants, to the animals, to the winds. So this interdependence meant that we lived in harmony with the way reality is. That is reality. That is the reality that we adapted to. And again, once we know that every breath we take, that every atom in our body is affected by the external environment, how could we doubt the primary and vital importance of maintaining cultural diversity in order to maintain biological diversity? And that means local knowledge systems. It means knowledge systems that are so adapted and so sophisticated that they do not maintain a dogmatic relationship to an idea of the river or the forest. They see the river changing. They experience the forest changing, and they relate to that as it changes. They also have an impact on it, but they are aware of an impact that is destroying the trees they depend on, that pollutes the water that they depend on. So the local knowledge systems and cultural diversity are absolutely essential. Really important right now when we talk about that is to realize that we are now in a world where these giant global corporations and banks that do operate like a machine that is fundamentally anti-life, that is continuing to build on the assumption that life is static, that we are separate, that we can control life. We are in a system now where that global empire has understood at a superficial level the truth about cultural and biological diversity, and we're now getting wonderful language about the need to maintain them. We're getting wonderful language about genuine sustainability, about climate and the need to deal with, stabilizing climate. We're getting wonderful language about poverty and how to eradicate it and how to raise the status of women. We're now also arriving at a place where there's a lot of talk about the wisdom of indigenous culture and the need to learn from that, the need to protect it. However, the reality of the institutions that have been built up, the way the financial system operates, this completely illegal global system that has no rules, that pays no taxes, that system is continuing to operate according to the foundational belief of modernity, which is life as a machine, we are separate, and it is thriving because of over-specialization, the engineer, and particularly now in the internet and mobile phone system, we're talking about such specialization, such narrow knowledge, no one laying, before their eyes the truth of what that system as a techno-economic machine does. The top-down knowledge system that believes that you can sit at Harvard and understand the biodiversity of the world. You just need to document it. That is a mechanistic, machine-like approach that has become infinitely more destructive, more powerfully destructive than it was 100 years ago. So that is part of the big picture we have to understand now. And in some ways, the co-optation of truth through that system, that probably is the single most important issue and central to big picture activism. Also want to say simultaneously that in my experience, I've known personally many of those scientists who were narrowly focused. I've known prime ministers, ministers, powerful CEOs. And I really want to stress that I have great compassion and, as it were, understanding for their blindness. Sometimes for me it's harder with environmental activists who I feel have had more information about the truth of biodiversity loss, cultural destruction, but who still maintain a perspective and a voice that supports this artificial top-down monoculture that is deadly. So, however, whoever it is, even those activists, I feel we should proceed with great compassion and not blame the individual, not blame, as Gandhi said, the sinner, but the sin. Let's look at the structures, let's look at the blindness, and let's do everything we can to raise awareness about that without demonizing particular individuals or particular corporations. Let's just get on with building a movement that demands that humanity is liberated. We need a human liberation front that will allow us to return to our home in life. And that absolutely means a type of localization as essential. We can maybe use another word, but that is what we need to do, and we need to do it as rapidly as possible. And we need to really show how rapid the healing can be if we're allowed to do that. And now we need to be shifting subsidies, taxes, regulations in that direction. And it would be quite remarkable what we could attain if we did.
Absolutely. I think as we're talking about, big picture activism and looking at structures and the things that create all these symptoms is mythologies, and we have the myth of progress. I'd love if you could describe what is the myth of progress and why is that such a dangerous myth that is pervasive through our society?
Yeah, I mean, actually what's happened is that, as I said before, we've been trained into believing that this urbanizing path, that this path of total dependence on global banks and business is some kind of natural process. It's been very much linked to the belief that technology somehow just marches on as some inevitable progress. But technology, money is a technology, and it's been the marriage of money and other technologies which has allowed global elites to dominate, to destroy local economies, to destroy local knowledge systems, to break down our relationships to one another and to nature, and to make us very vulnerable to propaganda, very fearful and unable to know anymore what's true and what isn't. So progress is really the word that is used to tell us, there's absolutely no point questioning that this new superhighway is going to go straight through the park or the forest that you love, or that now we're going to have a speedier transportation network that's going to destroy the slower, more human scale structures you had, because we're just told to believe that progress is evolutionary. It's particularly true in the West, this blindness, that somehow we don't look anymore at the policies that are supporting the speed. The global infrastructure, the speeding up has completely facilitated the wealth accumulation in giant corporations. It's there for them. It's not for us. The super straight highway, not for our cars. The cars could happily go on roads that allow the mountains to continue, that follow the curves. But, tunneling through and having these super highways is for the giant lorries that are transporting things back and forth. And there is a very important statistic there from England that I found working with an economist and an engineer in the 90s, trying to look at these hidden subsidies for these global wealthy corporations. It turns out that those lorries or trucks that are carrying things back and forth, if they paid what they should be paying compared to what the family car has to pay for road tax. Back in the 90s in England, the family car had to pay about £270 a year. Now, if you looked at the damage that those lorries do to the road and the axle load, the weight on the road, the average truck would be paying £1 million a year. So it's unbelievable how little we have understood of how destructive that trade is. Because remember, if we were eating food out of our own region or country even, no multinational would make money. But it's by importing and exporting the same product that the multinationals can extract wealth from us. This is also why that system loves mass tourism, mass uprooting, mass immigration. It's a consequence of destroying those local relationships. So once you see that whole picture, it truly couldn't be more evil, and yet it's not evil people. It's not some kind of evil organism growing, from thousands of years. It's very clear where it comes from. When you really step back and look at it, it is such a wasteful system. It is so, it creates such inequality and such human and ecological destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. And, just sort of continuing on this line of questioning around progress.
Yeah. You
mentioned in Ancient Futures that something that I hadn't thought about, but I think I hadn't put it in this language, but you said that we measure, so much of the progress that we measure comes from how bad things were during the Industrial Revolution and how much better by comparison they are now.
Yes.
But it ignores the entire swath of human history that came before. Yeah. Could you just maybe elucidate that a little bit more?
Yeah. I remember actually in America, someone who'd been in one of our study groups a long time ago actually said, I never realized, I thought I had been sort of brainwashed into fear against communism, but I now realize that I've been brainwashed into a fear of the past. And so the whole model of progress in the communist, socialist, and capitalist countries that had such faith in progress and industrialization, they completely denied access to the truth about what life was like when people did have a network of interdependent, where they were able to meet their needs from the land, to provide for their needs without being dependent on a system that divided them from one another, increased the gap between rich and poor, and destroyed the environment. So in many cases, the baseline is sort of Dickensian London, which was a mess because of the enclosures. People have been driven into the city. No social structures anymore to depend on each other. The gap between rich and poor is huge. Ill health was rampant, filth, pollution. And that is what we're served as the baseline. And of course, there isn't that much evidence from earlier that there is plenty enough for us to look at that honestly. And a lot of it comes from missionaries and traders who went out to conquer the world, to rob people of their resources, and their reports in most cases, is that what they encountered were healthy, peaceful people. In America with the native tribes, once they started to grab their land, they got resistance, and then these same people would be described as violent and, evil. But early reports, very, very important evidence.
Why is a GDP not an effective way of understanding the health and happiness of a society, which is what we generally do? All the dialogue about the success of a society or a country is all based around GDP. Why is that not a good metric?
Yeah, GDP, when you look at it honestly, is simply about exchanges of money. And those exchanges of money go up with breakdown. So literally, if you and I are robbed and have to go out and buy new whatever, a new car, a new telephone, that adds to GDP. If you and I are ill and have to go to hospital regularly, maybe for chemotherapy or whatever, that also helps GDP. Money is exchanged. Whereas if we grow a garden and stay healthy, it's unpatriotic, but literally not contributing. So this sort of self-reliance, which I prefer to call community reliance, where we are able to grow food in the local region, dependent on one another, not on an industrial top-down state and the corporate global traders behind it. That is the only way that we're going to regain real health, because it's linked again to restoring biodiversity and so on. But in the meanwhile, this industrial march of progress, which brought in a lot of so-called cheap fossil fuels, at every step of the way created more pollution, more ill health, and led to economic transactions. We're basically saying that a process of commercialization, which rises with breakdown, is progress. So GDP goes up with that. So also to the point where if you're so lonely, you hire an escort to go out. Very good for GDP. If you're satisfied with your partner and living a life where you don't need to be paying for babysitting or going out or singing or dancing, if it's done as part of community, you are actually unpatriotic, if you like, because our nation states are so blindly wedded to this measure that they are increasing crime, pollution, ill health in the name of progress, growth of GDP.
Yeah. And
again, I just so wish that we could wake more environmentalists up to this,
Yeah, maybe could you talk a little bit about what you feel, what message you would want to impart to environmentalists? Because I find that there is a lot of misinformation or just misunderstanding about what humans are in the environmental movement.
Yeah.
And that's been something that I've really confronted even just recently, is just there's a lot of misanthropy. There's a lot of lack of connecting the dots between all of these things. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. When we look at the truth of what GDP measures, when we look at the truth of what progress actually entails, and we understand that the widening gap between rich and poor, people rushing faster and faster and more competitive, more unhappy, when we understand the connection to the economy, the first thing we need to do is to look at that and be willing to build a movement for economic change. Why not? Why do we have to have a movement to reduce carbon, or a movement to just plant trees, or a movement to just deal with the hungry or the ill? A linked up movement where we understand that whatever our particular cause, which is absolutely understandable that people want to focus on individual issues, but linking that to a demand for an economic shift. This is what we need. What I see happening now is, as the crises grow, and very importantly, as the avenues of knowledge have been colonized. So these big corporations, again, not evil individuals, but a vested interest to keep the system going, are preventing the truth saying from getting out. They are aware, they're questioning global trade, and genuinely localizing economies, of course, would reduce their power and their wealth. So we have in school books, universities, in the media, every avenue of knowledge colonized by big money, blocking this bigger picture from getting out. Because I know that many people who are part of a system that blocks it are not themselves aware. I still feel optimistic that we can try to break through. But I think what we have to focus on is not just critiquing the system, but, as I say, spelling out the true and real solutions that are miraculously proliferating. It's such a testimony to human goodwill and perseverance. So we just need to do what we can now to get this out. I would urge people to try to meet in each other's homes and almost operate a bit like Tupperware network marketing, sharing the films, sharing the materials, to have discussions. And I think that the most convincing information that I have seen having impact on people is when they have experience of both themselves living in the sort of heart of the urban commercial system, but also living in something more land-based, something more community-based. And that could be, an eco-village in their own country. Even better, it's often in the so-called poor countries that people have experienced, that people were happier and had more time, even as you were told they have nothing. These people have nothing. When you realize that what we really value is good family relationships, good social relationships generally, ultimately that need to be loved and to belong. Then we won't say about these people they have nothing, when they have much more community and intergenerational, deep interdependence. So this is why in our work we try to convey, a global picture from both so-called South and North, or poor country, rich country. So that's one way that people can start rethinking. I do also feel that once we're helped to be more honest about how we feel about ourselves, so again, the circle sitting together with other people, deeply sharing about how we feel, once we can reconnect in that way, then that's the foundation of being willing and open to rethinking what the big system is doing. Because we are so shattered into quite neurotic individuals, because in the industrial world we never had enough love as children, and so none of us feel deeply self-respecting and self-loving enough. And this is an absolute truth, that we need that in order to become loving to others, in order to move away from defenses and showing off. And so once we share those stories together, that's a key in this localization movement that we're trying to help create. And we need to find ways of sharing this now through the media, maybe making use of AI, the mobile phone, the internet, to encourage people to get back to that face-to-face, deep interaction, and then rethinking these layers of manipulation and false ideas about GDP, about progress, and so on.
So I'd like to talk about technology, and just in general, your thoughts on technology and how we've been continually been told the promises of technology, they're going to fix the economic problems, the ecological problems. We're always kind of inundated with these new technologies. And it really seems to have kind of culminated in the big climax of AI and the promise of AI. And I'm curious what you think about the potential pitfalls of that, and if that is, your thoughts on AI and technology at large.
Yeah, well, I think in many ways right now, AI is one of the most important issues, because we need to step back a bit. And first of all, it's just terrible discussions about technology that don't distinguish between a fork and a spade and what we call mega technological systems. So again, if we were able to go back and look at, for instance, time pressures on people in the world before these time-saving technologies, particularly of the internet and the mobile phone. So, it would become so clear that these technologies have not served to give us more time. Just think about, a secretary who worked in the 1980s and would be asked to type, maybe 20 letters would be a lot. And now, dealing with 200 emails, the pressure, the way that these technologies have actually robbed us of time is such a fundamental issue. Now, so, that also includes understanding what the car has done to communities. There are quite a lot of studies that have looked at the breakdown of community and cohesion. So if we remember again that there is so much evidence that we want to feel more connected, that we are robbed of our humanity when we are cut off and alone, do we need, to really get people to understand how much technology, including the cars, have separated us? Again, I talk in Ancient Futures about seeing this in a very, very dramatic way. They've been integral also in separating us, between rich and poor. And perhaps another aspect in all of this is that at the beginning of the environmental movement in the 70s, sort of 60s, 70s, people had really understood that what Rachel Carson was saying about the fact that science had become too narrowly focused became a clear mandate from the environmental movement to bring in more holistic, interdisciplinary knowledge into universities, into schools. Understood that thinking we can kill some insects with DDT actually harms the rest of the web of life, including us. At the same time, we were aware already by the 70s that we needed decentralization. And we were questioning this focus on GDP and this type of growth. We were aware that there were limits to this type of economic growth because economic growth was destroying the real economy. So now all of this, to a great extent, was subverted by the imposition of the internet, by computers and the internet. The sort of environmentalists who wanted to go back to the land, who wanted to live more in community, were now told, wow, now we have this wonderful tool. You can have your life in the village and you'll be able to use your computer to have livelihood. When this propaganda for computers was coming out, I started speaking against it, and I got such a negative reaction, particularly in the English-speaking world. So in Ancient Futures, I had written about it in the original Swedish and Danish version, just briefly saying that now moving into this dependence on the computer was like totally ignoring what we had learned about the need for interdisciplinary knowledge, holistic knowledge, and now it was like deciding to walk on one leg when we had two, narrowing the perspective, introducing this speedy, narrow communication form. But I had such a negative reaction that I took it out of the English version. I thought if we can get people to understand the economic dimension, these giant corporations having so much power, that will lead to the shift we need. But I have also tried to warn about how we now know that algorithms in both the social media and in the financial casino are these man-made machines looking for extracting profit to the top. And how do they do that in the social media? By encouraging extreme polarization, hatred. That leads to more clicks and extracts more wealth. In the financial casino, on a daily basis, these algorithms are looking for the cracks that will generate wealth to the top. And remember, GDP measures breakdown more than anything. So the accumulation of wealth with the use of algorithms has meant a speedier and speedier expansion and greater expansion of a system that is responsible for massively increasing the gap between rich and poor, massively. And we see it in every country. Now, AI is building on those algorithms. AI is going to facilitate a systemic, top-down destruction like we've never seen. Just please remember to study what the algorithms have done and be aware that AI in today's system is going to be used from that top-down system. Remember already now what it means to be on the computer and be told that you have to prove that you're a human. Think about the amount of time you have to spend now to follow these ridiculous instructions proving that you're human. Where is that coming from? Who's asking for that? It's the same extractive wealth corporate system. People are already now struggling with their accounts in banks, can't talk to a human being. And if you, after sometimes days, trying to talk to a human, sitting on the phone for hours, listening to algorithms, and you finally find a human, you see they're so trained into the system, they cannot deal with a unique individual situation. So this mass system, this global system, absolutely does not serve the needs of us as humans, doesn't serve the needs of nature, of life. We must decentralize. It's very sad that there are people who believe that these same tools of anonymity, which, by the way, also use massive amounts of resources, the minerals, the mining that's destroying whole countries, the search now also for competing in the deep sea bed and going to Mars and the moon for minerals, the water that's needed. How can environmentalists possibly believe that this is a way forward? How can they believe that blockchain is somehow going to create trust, is somehow going to bring us together in this honest, trusting way? Do we not understand that trust comes from deeper knowledge of others? Do we really believe that someone sending us an email and saying, I'm an honest, decent person, is going to be enough for us to develop trust? What else can blockchain do but bind us into groups where we have no idea who the other people are? I find it really difficult to understand. So let's right now distinguish between possibly even using AI if it's going to help us communicate that we really must come together to support more localized, community-based, fundamentally life-based ways of living. If AI can help us, the mobile phone, the internet, let's use it. But let's not confuse the need for sharing a big picture vision to help us come together, to help us restore our genuine trust, our genuine respect for others and for ourselves. Let's not confuse that and think that by intervening with blockchain that we're going to create the social relationships we need or the relationships we need with the plants, with the animals, with life. We need embodied whole knowledge, and that requires the deeper connection. So we're talking about a path of disconnection versus a path of connection. We're talking about a path of monoculture versus deep respect for diversity. We're talking about a path of widening the gap between rich and poor towards shrinking it. We're talking about supporting a man-made system of extraction to support a genuinely life-enhancing, genuinely sustainable way forward.
Yeah, and I think for me, I definitely feel like with AI, what I view it as is it's going to accelerate the story of the machine, because that's what it's built to do. I mean, it's built by the people who are the arbiters of the machine's society. Could you maybe talk a little bit about like why the machine worldview is so problematic?
Yeah, well, as part of what's been happening, the crazy thing that's been happening is that in the last decade or two, the enmeshment in technology and, beautiful minds, particularly very male minds, have been encouraged to become entrepreneurs in the tech world. We've had a romanticization of people like Steve Jobs and the people who were these heroes who brought in these technologies. We've had huge propaganda about how these technologies have helped us become so much better informed and so much more connected than ever before. What I've seen is the opposite. I've seen a world where, because less technology meant that people had more time, in my generation, young people were able to travel the world and actually experience less industrialized, more nature-based ways of living. Now, the pressures have led to so much competition, very much linked to technology. And that has meant that people aren't traveling anymore. And then on top of that, we have a climate narrative that tells them if they're ethical, they shouldn't travel. So I see less genuine, real information across the world. I see even in small towns, even in Leh, in Ladakh, 50 years ago, information in this city traveled much faster. People knew when something had happened or if there'd been maybe a theft or an accident, almost, within hours, even from far removed valleys. So I'm amazed by recognizing now how completely disconnected we all have become. We're linked to this global landscape and we're all in separate directions, speedy and disconnected and so badly informed. So again, that's part of this whole big picture thing of actually now searching for the real information and what's going on the ground, and then connecting that across the world. But the machine worldview and the tech worldview now is so locked into assumptions about GDP. People, highly intelligent people, even people who've been to India or China, are now claiming, well, globalization, it might have had some negative consequences, but in China and India, people are so much better off. Now, if they would live there and look at what actually happened, as people were pushed off the land into giant factories, treated like slaves, and found, again, this intense pressure, broke down family relationships, community relationships, they would say they're not better off at all. Again, it's that measure of GDP. And so in the tech world, I see people more and more enclosed in that world of numbers and statistics that more and more keep framing the entire world inside an industrial, man-made machine. So coming out of that it's happening, because what's also happening is that in Silicon Valley and places, people start developing a hunger for nature. So there are people who can afford it who are stepping up, going to farm, to reconnect with nature, because again, we are part of nature. We are made through our relationships with the rest of life. So I do feel, in the long run, absolutely convinced that we will come back to life The question is just over the next decade or so, which is all I'll be able probably to experience, is whether there'll be a bigger wake-up. There is a wake-up, but we want to try to accelerate that as much as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and one of the things that I think about, that I picked up on in your book, was you talked about how the yak was viewed as inefficient.
Yeah.
And how the Jersey cow was viewed as more efficient, even though you had to pump all of these global, commodities into that Jersey cow in order for it to produce milk. And so I'm curious, the idea of efficiency, why is that such a dangerous thing for us to be deifying so much?
Well, again, we have to ask where that framing comes from. And it's come from within this econometric, top-down, essentially totalitarian system that gained by getting us to see the more localized systems, slower systems as inefficient. So the speed, etc., was feeding into a way of life that was making us run faster and faster. Who wants that speed? So we have to completely question the statistics around efficiency, particularly the lie that we're too many people now to feed the world. One of the most important statistics we need to get out there is that small, diversified farms can produce vastly more per unit of land and water than any monoculture ever can. And this is why it is so wonderful to see evidence of that growing in the local food movement.
And we've kind of talked about human nature, but in relation to your experience with Ladakh, are humans inherently greedy? Are humans inherently greedy, or is it the systems we're put in that incentivize certain behaviors?
In Ladakh, it was so clear that people are not inherently greedy. First of all, the reality was that you could only have so many yaks or so many kilos of barley. So the greed that I saw created from the modern industrial urban economy, that was something completely different. And it was also natural. See, in a way, when we actually depended on human beings, on animals, on the land, on the grain, on the milk, like I say, you could only keep so much. There wasn't any need to keep accumulating. And also what we don't understand is that in those relationships, multiple relationships with multiple people, we were so much more secure. So what I witnessed was when these people were pushed into the city, suddenly now dependent on money and dependent on getting a job from top-down forces that they didn't know personally, now they were suddenly elbowing each other, competing for scarce jobs. And now the money that was doled out for those jobs, you didn't know what it was going to be worth tomorrow. You didn't know whether tomorrow the bread was going to cost 10% more, 20% more. So I saw that naturally, when people are thrown into this artificial situation, it's almost like a cage where we kept like animals and being controlled by people we don't even see. It's natural in that situation to want to keep amassing money for security. So that greed grows out of a situation that's very scary, very insecure. And of course, you want to have some savings when you have no idea what the market is going to do. And remember, that's true for all of us now. We see this massive escalation in the price of housing. And that, again, totally a consequence of this artificial market that pushes us into fewer and fewer cities. And so innate greed is not common, or even I think would be non-existent in nature-based societies. And remember, these are societies who are dependent on the real economy. There's nothing we use that doesn't come from nature, that doesn't rely essentially on living biodiversity, thriving. And when we depend on that real economy, the type of greed we see when we're moved into this artificial, man-made, machine-made environment, it's like night and day.
Great. I think one question that I feel that this is something that I think about all the time, and this is sort of, I guess, the thing that I feel the most strongly about and wanting to communicate to people. It's like, why is it important for people to feel like we truly belong on Earth? And why do misanthropist ideas about human nature and that humans are just a pestilence or we're a parasite, how do those narratives undermine our ability to actually live sustainably and create biodiversity and be part of the Earth as like a keystone species?
Yeah. Well, the idea that we're too many people and that we're destroying the Earth is growing these days, and is growing among, caring environmentalists who have been trained into believing a map of the world that says we're too many people to feed ourselves, that we are greedy by nature, and as the crises grow, people are being trained to blame human nature more and more. So it's not only that we're too many, but we're greedy by nature. There's some natural drive in us to just want to grow and grow. No human being wants to be 6 foot, 7 foot, 8 foot. There's nothing natural about it. And as I said earlier, when you depend on nature and the rewards of nature, there's no possibility even of accumulating these stashes of billions of dollars that's now happening in this artificial system. So, if people could only be told the truth that on smaller farms we can produce more, that we now need a human liberation front where we are allowed to come back to doing the things we need to do to heal ourselves, to feed ourselves, and to heal the planet. The idea that human beings, that human innate greed lies behind these multiple crises is the most important lie to counteract today. We have not been told that when we are allowed to work the land, to work with the animals, to work with other human beings, we can, in a gentle and caring way, produce more while simultaneously healing life. It's the industrial path that took us away, replaced us with machines, stupid, polluting machines that destroyed the soil, that were part of a journey taking us further and further from nature by a global elite. If we can get the truth out to show that by being allowed to work with a real living economy, we can produce more while reducing pollution, reducing energy consumption. We're on a crowded planet. We have this overabundant natural resource, which is human beings. We can show that when people go back to the land, after the stupid machines, they are now needed to nurture the individual plant, to pick the fruit that's ripe, not come along with a machine and pick every fruit and then often burn or throw away half of it. We couldn't have anything more inefficient than this techno-economic system that just rips out of nature, that creates now trawling nets that could contain 17 jumbo jets, instead of allowing fishermen to pick and choose what fish they're going to actually be catching, instead of the nets that just robs everything off the ocean floor and then throws away half of it. We have the escalating inefficiency and extraction like we've never seen before. This is why we're facing collapse. We must do what we can to liberate human beings. We become too expensive for ourselves because of an artificial economy that tells us that the mass-produced, the mass-harvested is cheaper. It isn't cheaper. We're not given access to the truth. We're enslaved in a system where the dollars are lying. Local, healthy, fresh food, natural wood, natural building materials of every kind, natural fibers, are all cheaper, and we could be freed to actually have a world of far greater beauty, far greater health, if we would move away from the lies of the techno-economic so-called efficiency. We are proving now in permaculture, in agroecology, in many localized, community-based ways of doing things, that we can do things that will provide for our needs in a generous, beautiful way while healing the earth. So we must start the journey now, and we must share this knowledge. People want to have natural, healthy food. People want to use their bodies. People want to be able to do more than just one thing. In this techno-economic industrial system, we've been pushed into becoming one-dimensional. I'm a nurse, I'm a lawyer, I'm this, I'm that. As we evolved, we were allowed to weave and grow and sing and dance and care, both for the health of others and to give them the love and the care they need. Human beings are not innately greedy. Human beings innately long for love and connection, and when they are allowed to move in that direction, they flourish.